Good morning, everyone, and welcome to a very special edition of the Pittsburgh Current podcast. As a child of the 80s, whenever I hear a very special episode, I always think of Blossom or one of those shows where, somebody does something wrong and learns a valuable lesson. We're probably going to learn some lessons today. Our guest today is Jim Rooney, a member of the historic Pittsburgh Rooney family. He's written a new book, A Different Way to Win, Dan Rooney's story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule. Jim, welcome to the Pittsburgh Current podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
There have been a lot of books written about your father and about your family. What made you decide to write this one, and what makes this one different from some of the other things we've read?
Right. So thank you. So I think that why I wanted to write it is I have read a lot of leadership books in my life, and I think there's a lot of excellent ones out there. There's some that are bad, but there's a lot of good ones. But and there's some very good stories in them about folks who pursued this approach or that approach.
Right.
But my father really was able to be very successful, and I try to he would not like me sort of patting him on the back,
Sure.
but able to be very successful in a very prominent, very highly recognizable industry, and so I think he did it in a way. I think it is a story about leading,
Right.
that shows that you can win and be a good person,
Right.
and so that's fundamentally what we tried to the story we tried to tell.
And I think that also what people I think would later learn about your father with things like the Rooney Rule, which you discuss in this book, is you can be successful, you can have a winning franchise or a winning business, and you can still sort of stick to what you believe in. I mean, your father saw something wasn't right in the way that the league was approaching the need for diversity, and so that's when he stepped up, and he was one of the forebearers of the Rooney Rule. Is that something that you always remember your father being somebody who stood on his principles as much as his business principles, his personal?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So I mean that is the story of the book, is that not only did he do those things, did he always try to include the basic values that he thought were important, and treating people fairly was certainly number one there.
Mm-hmm.
Giving folks an opportunity who weren't getting opportunities. Those things were very, very important to him. But I also make the case that they gave both him and the organizations he was involved with a competitive advantage. If you look at the Steelers in the 1970s, from 1969 to 1976, we drafted more players from the historically black colleges and universities than any other team. So you have John Stallworth, you have Donnie Shell, you have Mel Blount, you have Ernie Holmes, you have both superstars who went to the Hall of Fame, as well as the guys that were really playing that core role of filling in the blanks, coming from a place where no one else was even scouting them.
Right.
And because of Bill Nunn, who my father hired, one of the first African-American scouts, so not only was he sort of living these principles, but it wasn't a cost to him, it was a benefit.
Right.
And so I give four major examples of that throughout the book.
Give us one of those examples.
Right. So, I mean, certainly that's one. I think another one is we talk about his work in Ireland.
Yes.
And he went, we go back to the 1970s, and if you look at what was happening in Ireland, we understand it in a simple context as sort of this religious war. Mm-hmm. But the reality was it was playing out very similar to the civil rights struggle here in the United States.
Right.
So Catholics couldn't get jobs. They couldn't get loans from the bank. The schools weren't integrated. So my father created an organization with a whole host of people from the United States, but Tony O'Reilly, who was the CEO of the H.J. Heinz Corporation back then, they created an organization, and it's called the American Ireland Funds, and I sit on the board of the Ireland Funds today. But the fund in those days really worked on funding, first, integrating education, Catholic and Protestant schools. Second, workforce development programs. So there were ratios, and it depended on how many employees, but it was always getting to at least 60-40 and working towards 50-50.
Right.
You're not always going to get 50-50 in every company, but the idea that you were going from 10% to some major inclusion percentage there.
Right.
And then the same with the banks, making sure that banks were loaning to Catholics who were trying to start jobs. But he also did it in a way that he didn't shame the Protestant groups.
Yeah.
He brought them in. There were, within the Protestant community in Northern Ireland, there were people that were struggling very much to, the economy there had its challenges. Right. So, there was a complexity to this that he really paid attention to, but, he also carried that large commitment of, how are we going to create fairness in the system, and how do we create opportunities that provide an alternative to violence. So I think that's really where,
right.
when you ask the question, how, give me another example,
right.
that is in a way the best place where he dealt with a long-term struggle, right. and really made a substantial contribution. The other point we try to make in the book is, everything my father did that was effective was we talk about playing the long game.
Yeah.
So he goes to Ireland in 1972. You get the peace agreement in 1998, which other people negotiated it, but they all talked about that his work and the work of all the people he was involved with was so foundational. And then he becomes ambassador 10 years after that, and you still have these challenges. So these types of problems, whether it's the Rooney Rule and opportunities for minorities in football and now beyond, whether it's labor negotiations, or in the case we're talking about Ireland, he never looked at it like, okay, let's come up with some silver bullet today and this problem's going to go away. He understood that you stepped into the mess. It wasn't going to be fun. It wasn't going to be easy, but that it was actually, he believed that there was an efficiency of stepping in versus avoiding it, and that if you avoided something, you wouldn't get there.
And and again, a lot of younger readers and listeners, they certainly know of your father's tenure as ambassador under President Barack Obama.
Right.
But obviously his diplomacy, as you say, spans way back. How did he first get involved in the issues in Ireland? I'm obviously proud Irish family, but how did he get involved in those very serious matters over there?
Well, I think it comes to being, look, I'm not going to tell you that Dan Rooney was uber woke by modern standards, but I think he was woke.
Yeah.
I think that he was a guy that went over there, saw these troubles. There was a lot of money from the United States going to sort of enhance the violence. And he didn't necessarily disagree with the point of view that the Catholics were being discriminated against. Right. He just thought there was a better alternative. So he goes over there in the early 70s, sees this troubling situation, and I think he just felt like, there's something I can do here. And as I said, his partner, Tony O'Reilly, came from Ireland.
Right.
Now, Tony's from Dublin, but everyone in Ireland back in the 60s and 70s had some experience of what they called the Troubles. So he sort of helped inform him of, there's something to be done here, and the United States can play a crucial role in that.
One thing that I think I read, I don't know if it was an interview or if it was in the book, but your father, maybe it's on your author bio, but it's probably one thing your father didn't necessarily want would be another book about himself, because he was a very proud guy. So, I mean, you talk about the Rooney Rule in this. You talk about, and this all sort of builds the foundation of your father's leadership style, which I think is what you're really trying to express and talk about and kind of show. Explain a little bit about that, and how did that develop, his leadership? How would you describe his leadership style? Obviously, it's a hands in the mud kind of style, but it's also getting people in with you is often the challenge.
Right. So you're talking about so many of the great points, and look, my father, I think, would say the number one thing of a leader is followership.
Right.
If you're going to be a leader, people need to believe in you. So he was always about building trust. Was always trying to build strong relationships. That didn't mean that he was soft or didn't stand for what he stood for, but he always tried to bring different points of view to the table. He always tried to really listen and embrace folks who had those perspectives, tried to get as many people involved. He always tried to treat people with kindness and decency. The dignity of everyone he came in contact with was important to him. So there was this natural way that I think people felt like, well, this is a guy I can believe in. Even if I disagree with him, I feel like he's going to treat me fairly. Then he had that competence, okay, what are the issues here, whether it be the Rooney Rule and then bringing people in who had expertise in hiring. He didn't build all the infrastructure of the Rooney Rule. What he did was make sure it got done, and he brought in experts from a whole host of different fields who understood diversity and inclusion, who understood the hiring process, where the gaps were. So in building trust around as the framework, you can really lead and then bring the expertise you need. Then the second piece he had was that willingness to champion. So, the Rooney Rule is a perfect example of his leadership. So he gets the consensus from the 32 owners, which was tenuous to get all them to buy in.
Right.
But the next 15 years of his life, he worked with a gentleman named John Wooten, who, along with Bill Nunn, was one of the first African-American scouts. So he and John Wooten, were on the phone constantly, talking to teams about their hiring process, talking to the different candidates, trying to make sure that people were aware of their strengths, where there were opportunities to talk to them, making sure that those folks, were working throughout, particularly minority coaches, but all coaches, were developing under several different coaches, so they would learn not just one way to sort of develop their own coaching portfolio, so that there was this constant advocacy or championing of the process, and I think that. So I've described it in sort of a larger, complex term, but there was a woman named Katie Keogh who worked for him, and I'm jumping story to story. But Katie worked at Embassy Dublin, and she said, the great thing about your father is that he would set this great example. We'd want to go do it, but if we needed something done, if someone needed to even call the White House, and we said, Ambassador Rooney, this is what we need done, he was the type of leader that afternoon he was on the phone getting things done, so that people had that sense that he was an advocate for the people who were on his team. And I think that's another essential quality of leadership, that people will follow you if they believe you're going to get things done. You set out the vision, but you're also going to be there to get your own things done, but help them when they're stuck.
Right. And I think that along that line, sort of very much simplifying it, the practice what you preach kind of thing. So then we come to the Mike Tomlin hire.
Right.
And that was, I personally, I loved it. And it was obviously met with mixed reviews. And it's even today, some folks are still, they question that move, even though you look at Mike Tomlin's record and it's amazing. Did your father go into that? Now we're talking about a franchise that, we go Noel Cowher. I mean, we're talking about decades there. And so it comes time for the, at least in my lifetime, the third coach. How did he go into that process, as far as how did he go into that process to make sure that, number one, that he was not just obeying the rule or whatever, but that it was more than that to your father? I have a feeling that it was more than just let's all do this, but it's really like believing in the process and getting into it. What was that process like when Mike Tomlin came in?
So you're hitting on the head. If there's two sort of technical skills my father was great at in business, one was negotiating, we talked a little bit about that, and then the other was hiring. And if you look at 3 coaches in 50 years, you look at him being the labor management negotiator, you look at the Rooney Rule, hiring was really important. And he thought bringing good people on your team, not just your field, the team on the field, but your management team was critical. So he took the Tomlin hiring, as he did with all the other 2 as well, very, very serious. So they started with 37 candidates, which I don't think most teams start with that wide of a pool. There were several minorities in that original list. They get down to 12. And actually, Mike was sort of an outlier. His resume was good, but he was very, very young. And the technical Rooney Rule candidate was Ron Rivera, who the former coach of the Carolina Panthers, who unfortunately just got fired this year. But Ron was the Rooney Rule interview. When you get down to the final interviews, you need one candidate. That's what the Rooney Rule. One minority candidate has to be part of the process. So Ron had sort of checked that box. But my father had and my brother had such a good conversation with Mike. They sort of were having him as sort of the outlier and saying, okay, let's keep bringing this guy into the fold, because you thought maybe he was a year or 2 away, but my father looked down the road as far as you could, and Mike just kept wowing them every time they had conversations. So then my father, again, being thorough and being very, very having things well planned, called Tony Dungy, he called John Wooten, and really wanted to get deeper referrals on Mike and understand them. And then, Mike talks about, look, from an X's and O's standpoint, it was Art and Kevin Colbert that went over the X and O conversations. With my father, it was all about values and beliefs. What's important to you? Talking to him, going out to dinner with he and Kia, building that relationship to understand, is this guy going to be an asset to our culture, or is this guy going to be a challenge? And at the end of the day, there's no question Mike's record, not just this season but throughout, has been fabulous. Yeah. And people like to criticize, and some of them are legitimate at times. I think some of them are not.
Right.
But you can't question the outcomes. There's only been one person during his tenure that's done better, and frankly, that situation in New England is an outlier the last 100 years. No one has achieved that type of success. So it's really impossible to make a credible argument against Mike Tomlin.
Right.
And we're proud and glad that he's been a great part of the organization, and I think represents who we are so well.
Yeah, and I mean, Mike was moving up the rank at Tampa, and then Minnesota, where he was before he came to Pittsburgh. He was just doing such a great job. So when that hire came, I'm like, I think that's and like you said, I'm like, I don't know if he's ready yet, but if you think that this is your guy in 2 years, and you're a team that hires once every 25 or 30 years, you got to give the guy a shot now. And won a Super Bowl. It's been to 2. He's been knocking on the door every year. He's just and not only a great guy, he's a great leader. And again, as a someone who studies leadership strategies, I mean, Mike Tomlin's leadership style, in my opinion, is one to be emulated.
And the play, if we bring good players in, and I think we do that, Kevin and Mike's part of that process. You bring good guys in, but then they want to follow him.
Yeah.
I mean, that's an essential component.
Right.
It's, again, followership is an important part of leadership, and those guys really like to play for Mike.
Yeah. So we talked a little bit about your dad. I want to talk to you a little bit about memories of your grandfather.
Sure.
And how did your grandfather's sort of, and he has sort of, I think, a little bit of a, at least from a public perspective, of I've just a handshake met your father. I've obviously never met your grandfather. What influence did your grandfather play on your father's leadership styles? Because your grandfather was a different guy. He was sort of the social guy. He was the larger than life character.
Yes. So he had a huge influence on my father's life. Probably bigger than anyone else's.
Yeah.
But they did have different personalities, as my father and my brother have different personalities.
Yeah.
But so two sides of the chief. On one, and I got to spend a lot of time with him. He was a great promoter, and then he was the best relationship manager, developer. We talk about these things in business, building networks. If you could have Art Rooney, on your sales team, you're doing unbelievably well.
Right.
He just built this trust with people almost immediately. You always go in a room and say, "Oh, how you doing? Where are you from?"
Right.
And they'd say, "I'm from Johnstown," and he would know some boxer or some baseball player from Johnstown, and he'd be talking about the hometown and just building that very genuine and authentic connection with anyone he came in contact with. So from that standpoint, he set the standard for my father that people are important. And fundamentally, that's what we're here to serve.
Yeah.
Look, we're in business. Yes, we want profits. We want things to be effective and successful. But there's a way to do that while also respecting the dignity of everyone that comes in contact. So that foundation was there. Mm-hmm. The other side, my grandfather to us, to the family, was tougher on all of us than he was to the outside world.
Yeah.
I remember I was driving with him once, and we're out in Arizona. We're going to pick my cousin up at the airport in Phoenix. And this was years ago when Phoenix wasn't what it is now, so the airport was kind of out in the middle of nowhere.
Right.
and I'm 16 years old. Just got my license.
Yeah.
And he goes, turn. And I go, where? He goes, back there. So he expected you to know what he wanted you to do.
Right.
He certainly treated my father that way. He would say to my father, well, do whatever you want, just don't screw it up.
Right.
So that was certainly some of his management advice.
Yeah.
But when you look at my father, my father went to Duquesne, and he really built the qualities my grandfather didn't have. My father was a great operator. My father knew, how much Pepsi was in every concession stand at Heinz Field or Three Rivers Stadium at the end of the game. He understood operations in a way that just was stronger than what my grandfather did.
Yeah.
But if you look at the end of my father's career, throughout, but certainly the latter parts, Ireland, the Rooney Rule, his relationship with labor, there were these evolving and growing qualities of becoming a better relationship person and bringing what I think was genuine, authentic inside my father out into these relationships. And I always feel like that helped him. That was that great balance between competency and this relation, this ability to respect everyone's dignity that became the foundation of these big projects that my father led. And if it wasn't for my grandfather, I don't know that he would have understood quite as well how important the personal connection was.
Gotcha. You're listening to the Pittsburgh Current Podcast. We're here with Jim Rooney, the author of A Different Way to Win, Dan Rooney's story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule. Jim, you have a book signing tonight, correct? 7 o'clock?
7 o'clock at Barnes & Noble in Settlers Ridge.
Gotcha. So you can go out there, you can get your book signed, meet Jim, talk about the Steelers. I'm sure you get a lot of Steeler questions from when the fans come out.
I never mind Steeler questions. When they stop asking them, then I'll be concerned.
Exactly. And you can get the book basically anywhere you get books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and sellers like that.
Giant Eagle.
Giant
Eagle's
Eagle,
been a great
correct.
partner
Yes,
of
Giant
ours.
Eagle. Yes, we talked about that, and I my management style is to forget and have someone else remind me. That's why I have Jake over there. So it's it's always good to have.
It's not a bad one.
Yeah, it's always good to have someone at your at the right hand, and with your father had.
And Jake has about 6 computers over there. So
He does. Jake is the man behind the scenes. Talking about just sort of as we wrap up here. I asked this. I had Doc Harris on the podcast last year, and I had talked to him a little bit about it. It was this time of year about some charitable work that he had done, and I just asked him what it was like. The holidays were like being Franco Harris's son, and he sort of got into a little bit of that. What were the holidays like for the Rooney family? I mean, it was a huge family. What was it like?
There's a lot of Rooneys.
Yeah.
So getting together logistically was always a challenge. My parents for a lot of years had this great holiday party after the last home game, and it would be so fun to see Gus and Yaya, who have the icy ball stand on the north side there, with Bill Cower,
right.
with the president of PNC Bank, with some neighbors from Manchester. I mean, you just had this great eclectic collection of folks who would get together once a year. So that was always a joy to be at that party. On the family side, I mean, we always have a nice sort of get together. It's usually around New Year's because there's 9 of us in my family, and so folks are at in-laws and things like that on Christmas. But our big holiday is the 4th of July.
Really?
Because there's no football on the 4th of July.
Makes sense.
So that's when we did the Lewis and Clark trip, all of these. My father, so we'd have trade-offs. So one year we'd get to go to the beach or somewhere fun, and the next year was an educational trip. We did Lewis and Clark. We did the Civil War. I wasn't there, but they did a bunch of the battlefields in Europe.
Yeah.
He was a big history buff, and
Yeah.
we all had to read. It was a big assignment when we go on these trips. So you had to pay attention. He actually brought Stephen Ambrose, who was the great writer of the Lewis and Clark story, Undaunted Courage. He had 2 of his lead researchers basically take us on the Lewis and Clark tour, and that was just fantastic to have them. We're on this bus going across Montana, and they're reading from the journals that Lewis and Clark's folks had. So that was our biggest time together, was the 4th of July, because football now,
it makes sense.
you basically get a week off, and it's the 4th of July week. Other
Right.
than that, football's going.
Yeah,
nowadays.
then you're ramping it back up for training camp.
But I hope everyone has a great holiday. It's a wonderful time.
And again, this book is a great gift if you know someone who is a Steeler fan, they're not just Steeler fans. I mean, I know that there are a lot of Dan Rooney fans out there. I mean, Dan Rooney should be sainted in the eyes of a lot of folks in this town. And so, if you go tonight to Settlers Ridge, 7:00, Barnes and Noble, you can have Jim sign that book for your father-in-law. Help get some brownie points. Jim, just finally, what's next for you? I mean, you're on the book tour, but what about you? I know that you worked with your father quite a bit. What's sort of on the horizon for you?
Well, I'm spending most of my focus on the book, but it has been an interesting process because people have asked me to come and speak beyond the book. They really want to hear my father's story. So engaging in sort of the expansion of his story is something that it's been a privilege. I interviewed 50 people for the book and get them to be part of it. We've had all kinds of celebrities tweet and do stuff. Wiz Khalifa, who you wouldn't necessarily think of, has this great tweet about, how my father helped his career at the very beginning. So many people were impacted by his life, and to get them involved in the conversation, it's been special. So I don't have a big plan beyond that at the moment, but being able to be part of that and lead it at times is it's something I enjoy and is a privilege to do.
And a bonus topic, because I meant to ask you about that earlier. I mean, obviously, you've lived sort of the life, you were there with your father, but you saw it necessary to go out and talk to these. I'm sure you have hours and hours of interviews with these 50 individuals.
Right.
What was the main, just kind of sum up, what was the main purpose for that? Is it you knew that other people maybe knew your father differently, maybe not better, but differently?
Right. So, I wanted to get a story that wasn't just my viewpoint, but really validate it or challenge it.
Yeah.
And so it was really unique, and I ended up doing it. We talked about this, while he was alive, but I ended up really starting right after he passed away. Mm-hmm. So you're in this experience where people are getting to grieve him. And Paul Tagliabue, who was the great commissioner before Roger Goodell, spent hours with him, and he's not an emotional guy. And I remember him, he's this nice law office down in Washington D.C. and just looking out his window over the Capitol, and you can see he was sort of taken over emotionally by thinking about my father and the work they did. Paul Tagliabue is as important to the Rooney Rule as Dan Rooney is, and the work they did there, the work they did on labor. Mel Blount had a great conversation with Mel, and him talking about this really challenging contract negotiation in the 70s, which he thought would sort of break the relationship with my father. And lo and behold, right after the contract negotiation, he opened the first Mel Blount Youth Home, and he said, the first person there to be part of the project, and he came down and spoke to the grand opening, was your father. And so this idea that you could have a very challenging, basically acrimonious negotiation, but then that my father was there to support him in this critical work. So to hear those stories, and to hear the emotion in them, to hear the experience that these folks had, that was really it was special. And I had it almost happened every time. I mean, there was not one that I can think of that was just sort of ho hum. Everyone spent some time talking about the personal engagement.
Right. Jim Rooney, A Different Way to Win. Dan Rooney's story from the Super Bowl to the Rooney Rule. Thank you very much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
It's great to be here. Really enjoyed the time and the space, and you got a really cool thing going. So
thank you very much. And a couple programming notes. Tomorrow, the regular episode of the Pittsburgh Current podcast will be 10 a.m. Bethany Rue will sit down with Dwight Penny, the executive pastry chef at the Fairmont Hotel. I'm sorry, Thursday. Today is Tuesday. I thought today was Wednesday. On Thursday at 10 a.m. Sorry. Dwight Penny, he was also recently on the Food Network's Holiday Baking Championship. So he'll be on to share some holiday recipes and talk about that experience. Also, the Pittsburgh Current will return in print form on January 14th. We won't be having another print issue this year. However, you can follow us at pittsburghcurrent.com, and we'll keep you updated throughout the holidays. Thank you for joining us today, and have a great holiday.